Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. It's a great pleasure to meet you during this webinar, and I also would like to welcome our lecturers. As you remember, for many, many years, we always have been teaching the difference between efficacy and effectivity. But only recently, we have a new scientific field which has been so rapidly developed, real-world evidence studies. It is a real complicated methodology, and we think that by broadly using this method, we will get much more information about the correct use of medicine in the public, and it will also introduce much help in further drug development. We also hope that these data can be used later for registration, especially for orphan drugs. With that, I would like to introduce you to two lecturers, Laura Fabbri first, who is a PhD in biology and clinical pharmacology. The last 20 years, she has been working with Chiesi. Formerly, she worked with GlaxoSmithKline. She has a large experience in the coordination and management of different clinical team groups to deliver clinical projects on phase 1 and 4 drugs, nationally and worldwide, and writing clinical development plans and single clinical protocols, study reports, and manuscripts. In the last year and a half, she is building a unit in real-world evidence in Chiesi for the first time and creating the connection with networks, registries, agencies, and most proper internal and external groups for regulatory and post-approval real-world evidence activities. I think in your lecture you will see that it's not easy to manage this field at a high scientific level. Laura Fabbri, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us, and please take it over.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone also by me, and a pleasure to discuss this topic all together. And I really think that we have to look forward, as this picture wants to say you, without a doubt, without fear, building something new and useful for the science. So I am really honored to discuss this topic and also to share an example of company position and strategy by the Chiesi Farmaceutici, to which I belong, as a mid-size company example. So first of all, why we are here. There is a strong why, a strong background, and just to introduce the further slides, the concepts are already here. Real-world data and evidence certainly have the ability to characterize a patient's their unmet needs. It expedites understanding of disease and informs later decision-making throughout all the product life. And we have to collaborate across different stakeholders, because in this way, real-world evidence can deliver improved health information infrastructure and regulatory regime that facilitate then the dialogue on evidence generation plans for faster decision-making. That it is a clear priority is no doubt. Suffice to report just some pictures on how many articles we have on this topic, how we should become familiar with this terminology, big data, real data, monitoring, digital. They are topics really present day, really very actual. And so for this reason, we have to speak about what. I mean, real-world evidence is a priority, no doubt. But what does it mean? So a few words may be already known by some of you. I suppose that this definition, there are many definitions, but more or less we want to say that it is an evidence generated from data collected in real world. So outside randomized control trials, but kept from routine clinical practice and related to the real patient disease and also their treatment. And it includes the patient's voice and also caregivers generated data derived from either primary or secondary data collection from different sources as we are reported, such as claims and also as records, registries, patients reported outcomes, the so abbreviated, very known PROs, digital tools, mobile devices.
Sorry, can I intervene for a second? Please, if you have any question to the lecturer, use a Q&A system, and also at the end of the lecture, Mrs. Fabbri will have the pleasure to answer your question. Sorry for interrupting you, but I forgot to announce.
No, very important. It will be my pleasure to answer your questions. And to expand the concepts already anticipated, we have to keep in mind so that with the real world evidence, we can understand the disease natural history, the treatment patterns, the optimization to manage our patients, impact on public health, and can support, is clear, also the product development and utilization, because can help to identify the right novel and the right novel outcome measures, such as, for example, digital endpoints or PROs, as said. Through real-world evidence, we can better monitoring risk and benefits throughout the drug life cycle, and also the patient's adherence. Can help to support assessment and decision-making by regulators and HTA bodies, as we'll hear also later on, and can provide insights for life science research. For example, certainly can help for the identification of patients' phenotypes with a high unmet need. And its use is applicable also for increasing the sustainability and the effectiveness of health systems. So again, what can give real-world data and evidence to the most important stakeholders we have in this field? So patients, regulators, doctors, ACPs, researchers and developers, and payers, because real-world data provides valuable insight into patient perspectives not otherwise feasible, could support the decision-making across the product life cycle, can provide also for HCPs meaningful insights into diagnosis, treatment, management, and prevention of diseases. The researchers are helped because we can give elements for informing R&D strategies. And for payers, certainly real-world evidence contributes directly to health economic analysis, and so reduce the reliance on modeling assumptions. And how we can use real world. Let me summarize in this slide that certainly real world studies, surveys can help can complement randomized clinical trials. On a side, we have RCTs on a highly select participants, while real world means working with heterogeneous population. The first in controlled conditions, the second real world in routine practice and settings. The first RCTs are, of course, limited duration in comparison to real world collection, real world database, which reflect diverse patient behaviors for long. And RCTs have a higher internal validity, while real world and higher external generalizability. And again, how certainly can strengthen the efficiency of RCTs for hypothesis generation, patient identification, endpoint clarification, prognostic factor identification, and feasibility determination, answering to the listed questions here. For example, what are the appropriate comparator treatments? Or, for example, is the study likely to succeed because can give us a confirmation on the appropriate, as reported here, inclusion and exclusion criteria, or if the patients are feasible, can be recruited in reasonable time. And another point already, of course, you have already understood that this is the trend, and so the value of real-world evidence should be recognized, and it is already quite recognized by regulators. First of all, EMA. In Europe, let me say that EMA, it is quite advanced, and also FDA and other agencies. But I have reported in this slide the couple of references, very important reference, I mean EMA annual report or even New England Journal of Medicine for FDA. EMA. This data have the ability to significantly contribute to the way the benefit-risk balance of medicines is assessed over their entire life cycle. FDA is, of course, considering the potential to complement the knowledge gained from traditional clinical trials. But not only, we have also other agencies, the policies evolving around the world, because I have mentioned EMA, and I will expand a little bit more on EHDS and RWE EU. Also in FDA, we have real-world evidence inserted in PDUFA, in PMR, and label expansion, but not only. Also in UK, in Health Canada, they are proposing guidance or projects to use the real-world evidence to support regulatory decisions. And not only in Switzerland, in Japan, in China, in Taiwan, we have already established the discussions. And the potential future initiatives are by ICH, in South Korea and Brazil are discussing, and also at CHOMS and ICMRA level. Let me tell you a little bit more on European health data space. It is a priority for the European Commission because they want to create a reliable data ecosystem essential to accomplish a basic level of quality, relevance, and interoperability amongst the health data, with also the ability to link different sources. And in this way, EHDS will allow the exchange of patient data between different healthcare systems across Europe, and also can improve the use of health data for research and innovation, and also policy making. And certainly it requires access to the data in manner that is sustainable, predictable, and with which robustly protects data privacy. That is, of course, a main topic of interest among many different stakeholders, certainly pharmacists, but also medical doctors, certainly pharmacists, but also medical doctors, and everyone, and every stakeholders working in real-world data and evidence. And for this reason, EHDS will have a system of data governance and exchanging procedures to safeguard the quality of data, and also to create a strong infrastructure that can guarantee this interoperability. And EHDS will provide in this way a robust framework for using real-world data also for secondary research and to inform health policy making. And furthermore, the launch of Darwin during next year which is the EMA's own combined network for real-world data sets, will be added to this EHDS, and so will be utilized together to advance regulatory decision by performing real-world data-related research. Let me report also Darwin EU that it will expand capacity and increase profile for generating real-world evidence, because, as said, will connect the European Medicines Regulatory Network to the European Commission's EHDS. So we are in that direction, and EMA already used real-world evidence from the in-house databases and also this framework contract to use 8 research organizations. They have data from UK, France, Germany, and in progress also further 4 extra databases, Italy, Spain, and Romania. But now this Darwin EU is everywhere proposed, discussed, because will be a federated network of data sources providing evidence from real-world healthcare data. Data stay local, but will use a common data model, and the coordination centers will be Erasmus University Medical Centers in Rotterdam. So the future is the use of EHDS and the Darwin EU by EMA. And I think this slide can summarize the 3 key areas where real-world data analysis will be used in committees' decision-making, because from what I said so far, it's obvious that will support the planning and validity of applicant studies, will to understand the clinical context, and also to investigate association and impact, for example, effectiveness and safety studies, or here, disease epidemiology, or here, for example, design and feasibility of planned studies. But what is needed to gain this acceptability more and more of real-world data and evidence? We have to think about a common understanding of what constitutes fit for the intended purposes. And is needed also a demonstration by case studies and share what we learn. A development of guidance and best practices, and striving for internationally harmonized approaches, standardization. And is needed also an extensive stakeholders interaction and a streamlined involvement of sponsor in evidence generation. So, considering this outside context, the trends, the objectives by many of us, let me also share with you an example of what is doing in a mid-sized company as Chiesi Farmaceutici. How is evolving real-world evidence strategy here? This slide reports just a few information on Chiesi, just to give you the context. We are a company with 85 years of experience, but a traditional company that now is evolving. First of all, it was certified by B Corp, very careful on patients' voice. And so the importance of real-world evidence is more and more recognized. Is a company that in 2022 had a turnover last year of almost 3 billion euros. We are in 6,500 employees, operating in 31 countries and present in 100 nations, and having 7 R&D centers, and with an investment of 21.4% of the revenues. And here are reported the areas of interest: asthma, COPDs, neonatology, rare diseases, and cardiology. Just to summarize, we do not have time to go in details. Let me say that by the European Commission last year was considered the first among the Italian pharmaceutical companies, second among the Italian manufacturing companies, and 13th in Europe. So we started with creating, designing a vision in by 2025. We would like, in a real-world evidence field, I am the head of the unit. We would like to be recognized as a trusted partner among different stakeholders. Reliable in generating real-world evidence to advance disease knowledge, patient care, and value proposition of corporate brands. We wanted to be one integrated voices. We want to create an innovative culture and expertise, and to insert real-world evidence in our portfolio strategy, product development, and life cycle management. And so from the vision to our pillars, I think should be pillars for the different pharmas. Maybe there are some companies more advanced than us, but in any case, we want to be trusted by external stakeholders, as said, and so it means to work a lot with them. I mean, with patients, regulators, ACP payers. We want innovative culture and expertise. That means that we have to educate our colleagues, to have seminars to achieve standards internal in organization, generating innovation. We certainly, my team, want to foster this travel, this journey together, but different actors should develop a cross-functional way of working on CHESI real-world evidence initiative. We want to integrate real-world in our clinical development, so considering patient needs, disease knowledge, and also addressing local needs, certainly, and also into the entire life cycle management of our corporate brands. Then, how we'll reach these CHESI ambitions? Again, we have to establish accountabilities to develop expertise, as said, assessing real-world data infrastructure and network. And only then we will be able to use real-world evidence to deliver value and to prepare ourselves to interact with external decision makers. And so, considering the first 3 points, I am working with my team on this short and long-term strategy. It's important, as I said, to create an evidence network internal my company, to share and to collaborate, and not to duplicate the efforts in different departments. And there should be a coordination by a steering committee. We want to create an internal real-world data hub. I mean, from different sources than randomized control trials, so real-world data sources, and of course, prioritizing the subscription aligned to priority therapy areas. And in long term, in this way, we will be able to be self-sustaining and to facilitate a rapid analytics and observational studies immediately without the support of external, for example, CROs, or with limited use of them. And so we are creating a network. This is a steering committee from different groups, I mean R&D, pharmacovigilance, market access, local affiliates. And in this way, we will work together on clinical plans, on evidence generation plans, on local real-world evidence plan. And in this way, so what? We will be able to work better with the external experts. We will be able to engage patients for a more rapid marketing authorization, enhanced access for publication, and improve external reputation in this field. We have also created a SharePoint in case where everyone can achieve information on what we are, everyone in case, not externally. We can share organization, publications, mission, vision, everything here. And for let me complete this presentation saying that the data hub, as already anticipated, will be extremely important for sharing, for giving immediate questions to them. And because now we are not yet maximize the potential return of using real world data, because currently we outsource the majority of the data access, analytics, and also surrounding activities. And an enterprise-wide data strategy would streamline our approach to integrating real world data in our business activities, and increasing also the possibility to leverage patient data for multiple use cases. And we need, of course, experts for this, because everyone needs experts to establish a good network and also to ensure expertise internally. So we are working for processes, for procedures, for guidelines, to ensure that proper people and functions within the organization have access to this data. This is our approach. So for this reason, we have already established many collaborations with very important registries in the fields of our interest, so asthma, bronchiectasis, cough, for example, cystic fibrosis and idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and also neonatology. And we are scouting, of course, for clinical data general providers. We are also collaborating with the groups, which includes different pharma companies as EFPIA, at the Europe level, as Farmindustria at Italian level, Duke Margolis, for example, in US, and also CHOMS. Let me be a little more rapid because we need also questions. And I want to complete saying that all of these aspects have the goal to facilitate, as said, rapid analytics and observational studies, and in future, instituting a self-sustaining model for real-world evidence generation across the organization. This is our ideas in a new field, in a field in expansion, where certainly learning by doing will be the main strategy to be followed. We have to learn all together. I thank you for your attention so far. If you have couple of questions or more, even later I can answer also by mail, but if you want to start, maybe 5 minutes, we have Sandor.
Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture showing how difficult it is to organize such a system to work at a high level. I have 2 questions, and I think you could probably answer them very shortly. Ahmad Abdul Qadir asked, what is a major effect of antibiotic resistance in patients? I translate this question probably, how can real evidence work help to diminish antibiotic resistance? I think this is probably the question.
Can help, sorry, I couldn't hear you. Can help what? How
can real world evidence data help to overcome antibiotic resistance in the population?
I'm sorry, because in antibiotic I have not experience. Is not my company is not addressed to antibiotics. Certainly, in general, I think that real world evidence and working with this kind of networks can inform. Why not? Because I think that from the databases we can also classify the type of patients become resistant to antibiotics, which kind of antibiotics, and so on. So I think can help.
I think very much. The next question relates to, first of all, Mahmoud Chris, thanks very much for your excellent lecture. And that what would be high interest as robust evidence for regulatory authorities between immunogenicity data from randomized control studies or effectiveness data from real-world evidence in vaccine example. So I think probably the question relates relation between real-world evidence and randomized clinical studies in immunogenicity questions.
I think that randomized control trials for sure will be the starting point in any case. And then regulators can ask for confirmation of effectiveness during the practice. I mean, in post-marketing, they often ask for real-world evidence post-marketing studies in order to confirm, to receive confirmation and to support what a randomized control trials said. This is true in many fields, and I really think that also in the vaccines field is the same.
I see. Okay, thank you very much. I have only one short technical question. You explained beautifully the European development. How far can we now combine data from the United States, Australia, and Europe, for example?
I think, as I said, that Europe is quite advanced, but I am also part of different groups in United States, not in different in other regions, but at least in United States, the trend will be more and more a common language, a common meetings all together in order to achieve the same standards and also the same procedures. So I am sure that FDA and EMA will work also in this field together in order to not have surprises from one side differently to another. This is the most useful way of working, and they are in that direction. I know less, honestly, on Health Canada, for example.
Thank you very much, and let me thank you again in the name of all the participants, your excellent lecture, and thank you for answering the interesting two questions. With that, I would like to introduce Sreeram Ramagopalan, who is actually working and heading the principal and market access and payer evidence lead in a large UK consultancy. He has more than 50 years experience in real-world evidence studies. He has significant experience strategically planning and utilizing routinely collected data for health technology assessment to obtain and maintain reimbursement of medicines. He worked previously by Roche, Bristol, Myers, and Squibb and Evidera on health real-world evidence. He holds a PhD in epidemiology from the University of Oxford and from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He is international expert in real-world evidence. He also is academic editor for the journal PLOS ONE, and he is board member in several other journals. So he has a real great practical evidence in health technology assessment, how we can use real-world evidence. And thank you very much for joining us, and please take it over.
Thanks, Sandor, and thanks to Laura for giving you guys a nice overview of real-world evidence. I'll be talking specifically about how we can utilize real-world data and real-world evidence for health technology assessment in my talk today. So Laura's given you a nice overview of what real-world data and real-world evidence is, but just to give you some specific examples of what we think about real-world data sources. So these data sources can be relatively simple. It could be things like mortality data, census data, so understanding the size of a population, understanding survival rates of a particular disease in a population. It can then get a bit more technical, so looking at databases of people, for example, seeing their GP. So in the UK, there's a database called the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, or CPRD, and this has data on about 7 million patients in the UK and their encounters with their GP. So what's the GP diagnosing them with? What are they treating them with? What's the results of even blood tests and blood pressure results? So quite a rich clinical database. There are other data sets that are a bit more claims orientated or encounter related. So in the US, in Germany, in France, when you encounter the healthcare system, some things have to be paid for. And that is what we call a claims database. And that has data on whether someone's going to hospital, what are they going to hospital for, what's the surgery they had, what's the potential in-hospital treatment they had. We then have data that's of somewhat now, but also of the future. So we have social data from social media. We have wearables data as people wearing smartphones, smartwatches, and so forth. Now, the analysis of that data, and that could be relatively simple descriptive statistics, it could be quite complicated modeling approaches, it could be artificial intelligence and machine learning. That is what generates real-world evidence. And real-world evidence is the insights that we get from the analysis of real-world data. And that could be to better understand the incidence and prevalence of disease, how patients are currently being treated, and what are their outcomes and quality of life. So there is a distinction between data, which is the kind of unprocessed data that's coming in, and the insights that we're getting, which is what we call real-world evidence. Now, once you've got a randomized control trial for a drug, why do you need real-world evidence? So as Laura said, it's a complementary form of data to randomized control trials. And for example, there's certain things that you can't address in a randomized control trial. Randomized control trials tend to run for a certain period of time. So real-world data can be used to understand what's the longer-term outcomes of patients if they're taking treatments for many years or the lifetime. Randomized control trials also have select populations in terms of specified inclusion-exclusion criteria, and so there may be specific subgroups that you might be interested in to understand the benefits and potential harms of this medicine. You want to understand, so what you may have enabled to get market access for a drug, but you want to understand how doctors are using the drug. Are they thinking that certain patients are benefiting it? And so real-world data could help there. You also want to understand what's the patient perspective. So they're taking this drug in the real world. Is it really impacting their life in a material way? And then from a HTA or payer perspective, there's also the costs. And you don't really get that from randomized control trial, but what's the current cost of the disease? How are patients currently being treated? And then what's the cost of this new treatment, and what benefits does the new treatment potentially provide in terms of offsetting some of the costs? And real-world evidence can be used right throughout the product life cycle. So here's a life cycle of a drug, starting from early development, so early preclinical studies to kind of early phase trials, all the way to once it's on the market and launched and coming up to loss of patent. So both these lines reflect the use of various data sets. So the dark red line is the randomized control trial data set, and the lighter pink is the use of real-world evidence. So as you can see, when it comes up to launch, there's a massive use of the randomized control trial evidence. But once that's done, it's relatively not used because it doesn't really add much. The data is there and available. And that's where real-world evidence can be used in terms of post-marketing studies. So most drugs, once they're launched and got regulatory approval, there's mandated safety requirements. So we've been using real-world evidence for many years to understand the safety of drugs. There's also understanding how things that we've talked about once the drug's been available, how drugs are being used, are patients adhering to them, what's the clinical outcomes, and what's potentially effectiveness and comparative effectiveness as newer drugs are launched. Now, what I will be focusing on in my talk is the things that are coming up pre-launch, so things that you are putting together as a package to get reimbursement of your medicine to submitting to HTA agencies. And that's really understanding what's the unmet need and the burden of disease in patients that you're developing a new medicine for, what's the potential cost of the disease, what's the budget impact of the disease, and how they're currently being treated, what's their current standard of care and outcomes. Now, a health technology assessment agency has many different questions that it's thinking about whether or not to reimburse a drug. There's different systems across the globe. Some are more mature than others. In the UK, we've got a very mature HTA process, which is led by the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, or NICE. And that is a cost-effectiveness framework. That framework is very similar in Canada, Australia, and the Nordic countries. And then you have a very HTA agencies that are mature, but also focused on the clinical effectiveness, so how well does the drug work? And that is what you see in Germany and France. Now, regardless of whether they take a cost effectiveness or a clinical effectiveness approach, there are a number of questions. So the HTA agencies want to understand, basically, should they pay for this drug? And that's a number of different things, so such as what's the unmet need of the patient? Do they actually have drugs already that are working well, or is there a need for a new treatment? How well does the drug work? What's coming out of the clinical trials? Are there particular patient populations that the drug works better in? How does the drug work in standard of care as compared to standard of care or drugs that are currently available? What's the quality of life of patients, and is that improving by this new treatment? There's also the cost concern. So what is the cost of this new drug compared to drugs they're already paying for, and is it worth it? And also the budget impact. So they're slightly different things, but their drug may be cost effectiveness, but it may be potentially treating a large population of patients. So the budget impact to a country or a healthcare system could be substantial. So there's all these questions that HTA agencies are deliberating on. And a lot of these things is where real world evidence can help them with their decision making. Now, in this analysis, these researchers looked at HTA submissions over the last 10 years or so across the globe. So looking at about 16,000 HTA submissions. And the first figure, that graph one, shows the blue bar show the increase in the use of real world evidence into HTA submissions. So where we had about 6% of HTA submissions in 2011 using real world evidence, we're now having about 40% of HTA submissions, including some form of real world evidence. The graph below that shows where is that real world evidence coming from. So we've got a lot of use of patient or disease registries. We've got observational studies, and then we've got kind of the retrospective database studies, so databases that already exist and are having data that's routinely collected and being used for these HTA submissions. Now, the graph on the right is this thing about acceptance of real world evidence, and Laura touched it. So even though you're doing a real world evidence study and submitting it to a HTA agency, doesn't necessarily mean that a HTA agency is going to necessarily buy it or accept it. Because it's not a randomized controlled trial, so a randomized controlled trial, because of the nature of the process, if it's well done and it's truly randomized, that removes issues of bias and confounding, which it's not the case in a real world evidence study. You don't have a randomization process. So there are potential issues of bias and confounding, which I'll come to. And that means that HTA agencies, regulators, are potentially less willing to accept real world data because they don't know if the finding is true or not. Now, for some things, such as the incidence and prevalence of a disease, so these green bars show how likely is it to have been accepted. So things that are relatively straightforward, so how well a patient adheres, the incidence, prevalence of disease, the unmet need, current treatment patterns, they're quite well accepted. So if the study's been well done, appropriately capturing all the patients, then they're generally well accepted. Where things are looking at treatment effectiveness in patients, that has the biggest potential for bias and confounding to explain the result. So they are less well accepted by HTA agencies and regulators. I'll just skip through this one. And coming on to that issue of whether or not real world evidence is accepted but as a measure of treatment effectiveness, there is a specific use case, which is external control arms, which I want to speak about now. Now, in oncology, there's been some great strides made over the last 20 years or so. So this figure at the top shows the rate of mortality in lung cancer. And that has been declining over time over the last 20 years. And these researchers show that that is a result of new treatments. So new treatments that are becoming available have reduced the mortality for patients with cancer, which is fantastic news and shows that treatments are working in the real world. However, the figure on the right shows the 2-year survival rates for patients with lung cancer. So whilst there's been an improvement, so going from 25% going up to 50%, 2-year survival rate, we're still at 50%. So 50% of patients with lung cancer will die after 2 years. So there is tremendous room for improvement and to improve lives of patients with cancer. Now, if you are in oncology, there's a feeling that in order to really make a difference in patients with cancer, you need to treat what is called the driver mutation of the disease. So there's a single mutation that's kind of driving all the cancer cells in someone's body. And these driver mutations are present at different frequencies in patients with cancer. So you have some driver mutations that are present in 20, 30% of patients with cancer, such as the KRAS mutation. And then you have some mutations that are present in only about 0.1% or less than 0.1% of patients with cancer. Now, in order to run a randomized controlled trial in patients with a driver mutation that has a frequency of 0.1% or less, it will take decades. So if you're testing a new treatment, you have to sequence everyone with lung cancer in every country. and then and hopefully they will all be recruited into your trial and want to participate, and then you randomize them. And so the earliest time period that people have worked out for one of these rare mutations that you could run a randomized controlled trial is about 17 years. So imagine if you have to wait or run a trial for 17 years and a patient has to wait that long to get a new medicine. That is unacceptable to many people, to patients, to manufacturers, to run a trial for 20 years. And so there's ways of trying to speed up patient access to medicines that may provide a benefit. And one of these approaches is what we call a single arm trial. So you don't have that randomized control arm. You are giving patients that investigational medicine as a single arm study. Now, whilst a single arm trial may get you regulatory approval, because a regulator is predominantly concerned with the benefit risk of a medicine. So does the efficacy of the medicine outweigh any safety risks? And if you're able to show some good responses in patients and there's not many side effects, that will get you regulatory approval. So you can get, with a single arm trial, you can get FDA, you can get EMA approval. However, when it comes to HTA agencies and ultimately the people that are paying for a drug, they really want that comparative evidence, because they're paying for the evidence, paying for the drug, and they want to know, how does this medicine compare to drugs that they're already paying for? And that's the question of value. So they want to have a comparative evidence to see what's the value of this new medicine as compared to drugs that they're already paying for. Now, over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of work to understand whether a synthetic or external control arm can help here, providing that comparative evidence for HTA agencies. And that's where you have real-world data that provides that comparator arm. So patients are currently on standard of care, and you compare that to patients taking the drug in your single-arm trial, and use kind of statistical analysis to get the causal effect of this new treatment and hopefully show that there's benefit of this new treatment. Now, this all sounds well and good on paper, but over the last 4 or 5 years, for some of these, what we call ATMPs, so cell gene therapies, so we've got CAR T treatments and so on here, a number of the mature HTA agencies of the globe, so a green dot basically indicates whether or not they accepted real-world evidence or comparator, and anything else means that they really didn't accept real-world evidence. And so HTA agencies have really struggled to accept real-world evidence as a comparator to single-arm trials because of the issues of bias and confounding. And just to highlight the challenges of real-world evidence, so this is a study using the same UK database, the CPRD. They're looking at the risk of cancer for patients taking oral bisphosphonates. And in the study on the left, they show that there was no increased risk of getting cancer if you take oral bisphosphonates. The study on the right showed there's a 30% increased risk. And that is the real issue that we have with real-world data. You could have the same data set, but depending on the methods you've used, you can get different answers. And that's what causes HTA agencies and regulators concerns with real-world data, because depending on the way you analyze it, you may be able to get different results. And so what is the right result when they're looking at real-world data? And so HTA agencies have been pragmatic now. They realize that the issue of bias and confounding is a concern. So they've been developing their frameworks of what they would like to see as best practice in terms of the analytical methods and so on, in terms of, and the data sources that they would like to see in these external control arm submissions. So we had NICE that came out with their real-world evidence framework last year, and this year we've had CADEF in Canada and HAS in France come out with their real-world evidence framework and what they want to be seeing in real-world data when analyzed. And in collaboration with NICE, we've been working together on a framework for what you could be using for external control arms. So when you have the single arm trial compared to real world data, what are the best practice? So using non-small cell lung cancer as a demonstration project, we were looking to see what are the best practices. And we think there's 2 main things. The first one is what we call a target trial emulation approach. So this was developed by Miguel Hernan in Harvard. And it's a kind of a best practice methodology when you're analyzing real world data. So you basically take all the best bits of what you see in a randomized clinical trial and emulate that in real world data. So you have specific inclusion exclusion criteria, and you make sure that is fitted into your real world data set, and you have appropriate causal inference analysis to get your experimental result. Then once you have your effect estimate, because it's a real world data study, there is the potential for randomized because it's a real world data study, there's no randomization, so there's potential for bias and confounding. And so using kind of various different sensitivity analysis to understand what the impact of bias and confounding could be on your effect estimate. So two kind of approaches, and that has now led to NICE kind of being proactive. And when they see best practice, they're much more willing to accept real world data as the control arm. So, for example, in this example here, mobocertinib, the manufacturer submitted a single arm trial compared to real world data. And they said that the real world data actually was the best source of comparative evidence because the manufacturer had followed these best practices that was called out in their framework. Now, I just want to quickly skip over to what I think is the future of real world data and real world evidence. Now, in the HTA framework, where everything is a question of value, the big question is the value to whom. And so historically, HTA agencies have only really focused on the benefits to patients. So what's their benefit in terms of their length of life and the quality of life, so the QALY framework as it's known. However, many agencies, many researchers across the globe have actually said medicines provide a wider variety of value to not just patients, but their families and to society as a whole. And so ISPOR, the leading kind of health economics and outcomes research institute in the world, has put together what they call the ISPOR value flow. And these are different elements of value that a medicine could bring to patients, families, and society. And so real world evidence I see is really kind of better understanding all of these elements for HTA decision makers. So really understanding what is the current impact, not just of a disease, not just on their patients, but on the families and society. And then what is the value that medicines are bringing in terms of improving family quality of life, improving families being able to go back to work if there's children, if they're going back to school, if there's, in terms of society benefits, if they're going back to work, what's the tax benefits, what's the benefits in terms of reduced kind of disability benefits and so on. So there's a wide variety of value that medicines bring, and being able to quantify that really is able to be able to do so by real world data. And here, for example, this is a study looking at Danish registries where you're able to link a lot of different things in Denmark. You're able to link patient clinical details with whether or not they're going to work, whether they're married, whether they're getting benefits. So there's a lot of different data sets that you can link in the Nordic countries. And here they show that new treatments for lung cancer not only reduce their risk of death, but also reduce their risk of early retirement. So that these patients were able to taking new treatments, they were living longer and actually working longer as well. So improving their quality of life, contributing to their families, as well as contributing to society with tax revenues. And in the interest of time, just to say that there's a number of different data sets out there as well that could be leveraged to understand patients better. And one thing is social media, so things that you're posting on Twitter, Facebook, other patient blogs and so on. Here is basically a real world data set. So you're really understanding what's the patient feeling like, what disease do they have, what treatments are they getting, how are they doing on this treatment, and what's their potential sequence of treatments. And so processing all of this information using kind of natural language processing, so the things that are behind ChatGPT and so on, can really better understand what's happening with a patient. And as we get into more kind of wearable technologies, you can have a much better understanding of the impact of new medicines on patients. And with that, I'm happy to stop and in the interest of time and take some questions.
Thank you very much for that interesting and very eloquently presented lecture. May I also, I do not see any questions there. May I ask the audience whether they would like now to ask some questions directly? Until you are thinking, I just want to ask you something. We know that there, especially in cancer, there are a lot of drugs which receive accelerated approval. And it turns out later that some of these drugs are not useful and have to be withdrawn, but it's extremely difficult process in the United States, much easier in Europe. How far these RWE studies can help to accelerate the approval, the final approval of such an accelerated approved drugs?
No, that's a really good question. I think it's that trade-off between cancer patients have only X years to live, So we need to get drugs to them as quickly as possible. So that's why we've got these accelerated approval processes. And then, I mean, I think there is a challenge in terms of getting that reimbursed ex-US, so in HTA agencies where they're looking for that comparative data, which may be a single-arm trial. So that's where real-world evidence can potentially help in terms of that initial reimbursement. But then I think it should be conditional. So it should be a conditional approval where you're collecting data on patients in the real world and making a quick assessment in terms of actually, is it what we were expecting from that accelerated approval, from that initial trial, or not, and then quickly kind of withdrawing that approval. As you said, it is trickier to do so in the US, despite there being actually more data available on cancer patients in the US. It's actually tricky to get data, even in the UK, where there's quite a lot of good data sets out there. It's very hard to understand which patients are getting which treatment and what are their outcomes.
Do you expect that the real-world evidence data can make a change here in the future?
I hope so. I think we've had a lot of different I think there's a lot of promise in terms of the use of real-world evidence. So in the UK, there was a big deal done 20 years ago now, so something called the multiple sclerosis risk-sharing scheme. So this was treatments for multiple sclerosis, the first treatments, interferons. Yes, the UK government thought they were quite expensive, so they had this risk-sharing scheme, so they were collecting real-world data for 10 years to see how patients did. The real-world data findings weren't very conclusive, whether they worked or not. And so it wasn't clear who won. Did patients actually win? Was there a benefit to them? The manufacturer made their money. So it was unclear. And then we're having similar situations in Germany right now with spinal muscular atrophy. So there's these kind of conditional agreements where using registries to look at outcomes of patients taking these new kind of high-priced drugs for SMA. I think we need to be very pragmatic in terms of what are we designing? Do we have the right data sets to address this question? And can we appropriately address the outcomes? I do think it's the future, but we need to be having more data available and making sure that the analysis is going to answer the right question.
Thank you very much. May I ask again the audience, is there any further question which you would like to spontaneously ask from the lecturer? Or can I ask Fabrizio Laura whether she has a question or other people participating? I also, if we discuss that, partly I already alluded to, we have an enormous problem with orphan drugs used in rare diseases. It is very difficult to get together these patients. Do you look at, I ask both lecturers now, do you think that the regulatory authorities will accept more willingly real-world evidence data for supporting the registration of orphan drugs, or not, or they will definitely wait until there are controlled clinical studies proving the efficacy of such a drug, of orphan drugs?
If I may start, Sreeram, I really think that as much as orphan a disease, so with a few patients as more, they will be, of course, obliged, even let me use obliged to accept also innovative trials like real world. As you commented well, Sreeram, is not nothing new, is a new term because we already made this kind of studies in the past. Now we call them real world evidence studies. I'm sure that will be more and more accepted, especially for orphan diseases. Working with the registries will be mandatory for rare diseases. We have a rare disease unit where the application of real world evidence is more evident and will be certainly more accepted than in other fields. This is my...
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sreeram, do you have any comments to that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think a lot of these frameworks, they're already saying it should be used in orphan rare indications. It's not that you should get away with randomized controls or remove randomized control trials. Where you can run randomized control trials, you have to do so. But where you have the orphan populations, this is where they are looking for real world evidence.
Yes.
I have one last question. You have a real world evidence collected in UK, but if you are in another country like Hungary, in my country, you have to collect new data in a completely different organization. Do you see the possibility to transfer data from one country to the other one, or these are entirely, you have to do it always locally, all these studies for real-world evidence?
I mean, I think in the HTA setting, I think HTA agencies have been historically asking for data from their own country. I think they're beginning to realize that that's somewhat an impossible task. If they're asking for real-world evidence for rare patient populations, and if that population isn't big enough in your own country, you have to look at other data sources. I think you have to prove or justify that it's valid to move data. For example, data from the US, is that valid in the UK when there may be different standards of care, different treatment patterns, and so on? But as long as you can prove that it's not different across countries, I think they are a bit more willing to accept data coming from other countries now.
Before finish, I have really now got one question from the audience. I read it. I notice, this is for Divya George. I notice your slide states health technology assessment acceptance of real-world evidence data for safety as nearly 80%. Are there any new observations related to this trend in terms of quality and source of data?
Really good question. So I think it's just because we've been using real-world data for safety for the last 40 years. I think it's probably the first use of real-world data in industry, in the pharmaceutical industry. And so I think people are pretty comfortable. So you basically have to collect data on everyone that's taking a drug and see if they're reporting an adverse event. So it's not really complicated methodologically. And so that's why there's a greater willingness to accept that data. I don't know if Laura wants to add anything.
No, I agree. I agree. Nothing to add. I'm sure that this is.
If there is a common agreement, it is. Thank you very much for your for your excellent lecture and answering all the questions. I think for all of us, it was a real experience, and we now get a bit more information how to apply, how difficult it is to organize real-world evidence data set, how to apply that. So thank you very much in the name of all the participants of the webinar. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.